A Flash in the Dark, Chapter 12. Moving on. Joe's first thought at being tossed across the barn by nothing but the wind that Marden was controlling was, oh shit. His second thought was that Barry had been right about him. Then Marden had gone off on a rant about how he was God, and Joe had had enough. Why would God need to rob banks? Joe demanded. Then suddenly there was a tornado in the building. He grabbed Eddie and rushed outside. As the building behind them exploded with the force of the wind, he and Eddie were slammed into the car. Eddie was out cold, but Joe managed to find his footing and keep his head. A piece of the roof flew at him and he closed his eyes and threw up an arm to protect his face, waiting for the impact. But it never came. Instead, a streak of lightning intercepted the large piece of debris, sending it flying the other way. Then, just as Joe was about to radio for help, though he had no idea what they could do against a man who could control the weather, the debris was tossed aside, and a figure, dressed in what appeared to be head-to-toe red leather, stood up from underneath it. She tossed aside part of the costume, a breathing apparatus maybe, and spoke, seemingly over a radio, though he couldn't hear what she was saying. He watched in awe as she ran around the tornado, causing it to implode in on itself, sending her flying into a pile of debris. She pulled herself up, and Joe saw that her mask had come loose and was now hanging like a hood around her shoulders. His heart nearly stopped as he met the eyes of his foster daughter, Barry Allen. "Hey!" Marden's voice called from behind her. Barry turned and scrambled to her feet as Marden approached her, a gun in his hand.
"I didn't think there was anyone else like me,"
he said, his voice shaking slightly. Barry shook her head, glaring at Marden. "I'm not like you. You're a murderer," Barry accused. Marden sneered and raised the gun. Joe acted on instinct. Nobody threatened his kid and got away with it. 2 shots later, Marden was on the ground, and Barry was watching him almost warily. He dropped to his knees so he was level with her. They stayed there for a moment before Joe hugged his foster daughter. She wrapped her arms around him for a moment, then stiffened when she heard Eddie stir and sirens echo in the distance. "I can't be here. Not like this. I'll be back soon." Barry's voice was shaking. Joe nodded, still a bit shell-shocked. It really didn't help when Barry pulled the cowl back up with some difficulty. She had to force her very tangled ponytail back through it before it would go over her head. Then she raced off, another flash of lightning the only indication of her passage. A few hours later, Joe was calming down a bit when Barry showed up in a red button-up, jeans, and Hal's old jacket to do her CSI thing. She avoided Joe's eyes, setting about doing her work in silence as he watched her. She didn't leave, though, when she snapped her case closed. When she was done, she leaned against Joe's car, waiting for him, looking like a kid again, caught trying to sneak off to Iron Heights to see her father. Joe nodded for her to get into his car. Only once they were in the car did he let out a breath, shaky though it was.
"What you can do?" "It was the lightning bolt?"
Joe asked. Barry refused to meet his eyes. "More or less," Barry said, still not looking at him. Joe shook his head, almost in disbelief.
"I'm sorry, Barry. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I called you crazy for chasing the impossible. But you really did see something that night. And your dad is innocent,"
Joe said, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Barry nodded. Joe stopped the car outside the precinct.
"I need you to promise me something. I don't want you telling Iris about any of this, anything you can do, any of it. I want her safe. Promise me,"
Joe said, unbuckling his belt. Barry hesitated before nodding, holding back tears. "Yeah, I promise," she managed. Joe pulled her into a hug and smiled slightly, still a bit in shock. Barry was exhausted, emotionally and physically. All she wanted to do was go home and crash for a week, but she needed to do something first. Something she hadn't gotten a chance to do since she'd woken from the coma. She sat down in the hard metal chair and held back a small smile as the buzzer sounded and the guards brought her father into the visiting room. He smiled wide, tears in the corners of his eyes as he sat down. They both reached for their phones.
"Hey, Slugger," her father said, a few stray tears slipping down his face.
Barry laughed. "You've been calling me that since I was 11, Barry said, choking on her own tears. Henry Allen laughed lightly. Barry looked down at her hand for a moment. Funny thing is, I actually got into a fight today. Probably the first time since high school, Barry said with a laugh. Henry's face fell as he watched his daughter through the glass. You just got out of a coma. I'm not sure you should be picking fights, Henry gently chastised. Barry grinned slightly. Henry couldn't help but smile. He was just so happy to see his daughter upright and moving again. Hey, did you win? He asked. Yeah, I did, she said, grinning wide. Henry chuckled. Barry's eyes filled with tears. Are you doing all right? All the guards would tell me was you woke up. Should you be out of Star Labs yet? Henry asked. I'm all right, Dad. I promise. You didn't kill Mom. You know I know that, right? Barry asked. Henry smiled wide, tears in his own eyes. You believing me is all I need, Henry said, further tears falling. Barry's face grew determined. You're not going to be in here much longer. Whoever killed Mom, whatever killed her, I think I finally have a way to find them, to stop them. Her voice was steady. Henry's eyes softened. Barry was always trying to save him. Barry, we've talked about this. It's time to let go. You've got to stop worrying about me and live your life. Henry Allen sounded almost defeated. Barry nodded slightly. For the first time, I feel like I finally can. The truth is, since the night Mom died, I've been stuck in one place. Missed out on a lot of things. But I'm different now. I made some new friends, Barry admitted. Henry smiled at that. Barry had always had trouble making friends. It had been her and Iris against the world for a while now. Hal had helped, but from what he heard, the pilot was missing, declared dead. They're helping me find a way to move forward. Barry wiped her eyes. You remember when you wanted me to change my name so I wouldn't have to deal with people knowing you're my dad? She asked. Henry nodded. I'm glad they know. I am so proud to be your daughter, she assured. Henry smiled slightly. I love you, Barry, he said. Barry gave him a watery smile. I love you too, Dad. Barry put her hand up to the glass, and Henry met it with his, wishing with all his might that he could hug his daughter. Barry made it home that night after a very long day. She was even more tired now than she had been. She flopped down on her bed, dropping her purse next to it and kicking off her shoes. She buried her face in her pillow and smiled. Everything was looking up. Her phone buzzed, and she lazily pulled her purse up onto the bed and dug it out. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Len from the coffee shop. Hoping you had a better day today. Barry smiled, remembering the attractive man who'd bought her coffee what felt like ages ago. It was better, yeah. Much better. You? Leonard Snart grinned down at his phone as it pinged, signaling that he'd received a reply from Barry, the pretty brunette. He glanced over the schematics for the Central City Museum. Things were definitely looking up.